morning.
Hello.
Another one where Dave has joined us from the get-go.
Yeah. Another one? Has there been one? Oh, yes, there was
Yeah.
the one where you forgot to do it for ages.
Yes, it was like an hour late. So this week we're talking about books. As always, we'll start with people's earliest memories of books, and I'll go first. My earliest memories of books, actually the little readers, they were small and green and rectangular and about that big, and they're what you use to learn to read in school just the year after kindergarten. So your parents have to go through with them. And my reading level was very average as a child. I wasn't top of the class. I wasn't bottom of the class. I was like smack bang in the middle, very bumbling along at a very average pace for my age. Other than that, it was books, children's books that I got for birthday, such as One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. Played plenty of Dr. Seuss books in my time. And I don't know if you're familiar with the children's book Too Many Wheels, about a cat, like a humanoid cat, in the way that Mickey Mouse is a humanoid mouse, works at like a junkyard, and people just keep giving tires, and she doesn't know what to do with all of these tires, as I remember it. Then as I grew, like, I'm not what you would call a reader. My mother and my sister are huge readers, and Maddie is a huge reader. Based on your videos, Dave, I would say you're a reader. I'm not sure about Zach here.
Really depends. Really depends on the book. I'm very, very selective about what I read.
So am I. I'm super selective. Here's the thing, though. I've discovered I love watching fantasy, Harry Potter, whatnot. I don't particularly like reading it, though. Like, there's just something about fantasy writing that I don't... Because I've tried reading Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings and the Shannara series, and I just couldn't get into them. However, I do quite like proper science fiction, in that it's actually exploring what it means to be human, and it really technical. Whereas science fiction movies tend to be just whiz bang special effects sideshows, whereas a book gives me a full story and such like that. Then, of course, as I got older, I was older than the target audience for a book like Dinotopia, but I absolutely love I loved the first Dinotopia book. The second one was and I don't think I got the third one. I've got the first two though. But I love
What
the
about all the
art.
side books?
Oh no, I'm a purist. I'm a Dinotopia purist. And the movie / teleseries, that was atrocious.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you've seen it?
Yes.
Yeah, please do not judge the books on that. The book is fantastic. That movie is the worst. Right, we'll go with Dave next, I guess, or Dak, if you want to go while he finishes his brekkie.
Good idea.
Alright, Zachary. Books.
Books. Well, I guess I grew up in my family emphasized reading at a young age, and that would basically be even though my parents would come home, and it was mostly my dad. He'd be tired from working all day on his feet, and he would actually sit down and read books to me. I don't really remember some of the first ones. They were like the Dr. Seuss books, Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, Hop Pop. There was one called Are You My Mother, which was basically about a little bird who fell out of the nest and was going around and asking random animals, "Are you my mom? Are you my mom?" So it was adorable.
Based on your background, I would argue that you are quite the reader.
Oh, those are my dad's.
Fair enough. All of them,
Though,
or is there a mix?
all of them. There's like one or two that are mine that I had to move down because I don't have enough room on my bookshelf. But those are mostly my dad's books, and they're mostly martial arts books. So, but I do remember one of the very first books that my dad and I read together that I can remember, and that was it was a Godzilla book, not intended for kids at all. It was a Godzilla chapter, like it was an actual novel about Godzilla. Because I loved Godzilla, and I was my elementary school had a book fair. And they're just like, oh, and I'm like, oh my god, it's a Godzilla book. It's an actual Godzilla book. And my dad was just like, okay, it's cheap. And so he bought it for me, and then we sat there and read it together. And this book is clearly not meant for children at all. It's like, it's not. It's actually a really dark, dark book. But, yeah. But I do remember that. And then there was...
Speaking of the Godzilla book, was it a standalone book, or was it based on one of the movies?
It was a standalone. And then after that, Dinotopia, I got into that, mostly the side series, because my fourth grade teacher, there was nothing that I was interested in reading. And so she was just like, you need something to read. And she basically walked over and she's like, here, read one of these. You'll like these. And she was also the same teacher that convinced me to read all 7 of the Chronicles of Narnia at the same time, in one go, which I absolutely love those. I'm not going to lie, I'm actually a purist when it comes to, like, how Ian's a purist at Dinotopia. I'm a purist when it comes to the Chronicles of Narnia. So...
Purist in what sense? In that you read the books in the order they were printed in, or the order that they're intended to be read in?
The order they're intended to be read in, but when I saw the movies... Brief tangent, but when I saw the movie, the very first adaptation, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, I really liked it, because there were points in the movie where I could pause it and be like, yes, I remember this exact scene, this is how it happened. Then they did Prince Caspian, which is my second favorite book in the entire series.
Really?
And it focused on the kids, and not the titular character, and it kind of made me a little angry. And then I found out they brought the White Witch into the Dawn Treader, and I just went like, because Dawn Treader is my favorite.
It's a lot of people's favorite, apparently.
And I basically was like, oh wow, like they're making Dawn Treader into a movie, and I was actually really excited. And then I was just like, oh yeah, they bring in the White Witch, and it all was about finding 7 swords to defeat her, and I just went like this. Done.
Mm-hmm. But actually, honestly, I thought I enjoyed that film the best out of the 3 movies. I thought it was the most well presented. You might enjoy, Zach, the old British BBC series.
Well, I was about to bring that up myself, except that surely the Caspian Dawn Treader series is the most boring one of the BBC lot, so maybe not.
I do have to say that the one that I wanted them to make into the movie the most was the last book, where C.S. Lewis basically said, the world's coming, where basically C.S. Lewis just said, that's it, game over. Mm-hmm. Because I remember reading that book in the 4th grade, sitting there and reading it, and just how dark and grim everything was. And as a 4th grader, and reading all the other books and how sort of like a couple of the, like, granted they weren't very lighthearted, but they were definitely appealed to a much younger audience. And reading this last, like, The Silver Chair, which was pretty dark at points, but now reading this book where he basically says the stars are falling, Narnia is burning up, it's falling apart, and I'm just like, granted, when I got older, I was able to appreciate what he was actually going for and the symbolism behind it, but Plus, also at that point, I had taken a class where we referenced C.S. Lewis because of the essays he had written about religion and Christianity, so there was that too.
I've found the TV series, as far as I'm aware, was quite accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But you will have to put up with like men in suits kind of a thing.
Did you
Like
see it, Ian? Did you see it actually at the time, or have you watched it since?
I saw it when it was on telly here in Australia when it was a new series, and I really haven't watched it since.
It was, I have watched it since, but I saw it when it was actually coming out, and it was. It's difficult to really put this across now because you look at it and it's very simple, as you say, people in big animal suits. Half of the characters are, well, not characters, but half of the like animals and dragons and things are just animated in sort of very light pastel-y ways. It's very, very low tech, but at the time, it was event TV. I mean, I remember the world building up to the first episode being on, and then it was one of those series where by the time the next episode comes on, you've watched the last episode 7 or 8 times. It was quite a thing.
Right. Yeah. Aslan was the big one of that because he was a big animatronic lion, and
I was convinced that was a real lion, and my parents were like, "No, that's a puppet." And I'm like, "No, it isn't. That's a real lion."
That was the crowning achievement of that show. My favorite series was actually the last one, The Magician's Nephew.
Did they do The Magician's Nephew?
They did?
They did. They did every single book.
No, they never. They can't have. They didn't do The Last Battle, did they?
I watched every episode long after the show's popularity had died down and no one was watching it anymore. I hung on till the very, very end.
Oh,
wow.
But and again, I only saw it the one time when it was on telly.
Yeah.
So how did you progress from like childhood into then I guess teenagehood into adulthood, and how did your tastes change?
One author.
Yeah.
Stephen King.
Who I've heard is very wordy.
He is very wordy, and depending upon which version of Stephen King you are reading, because there's actually, from what I found, 3 stages of Stephen King. There is the pre-rehab Stephen King.
Yeah.
Then there is immediately following that, and then there's modern King. And
okay. What about Pen Ghostwriter King?
It depends. Some of his stuff is pretty good, but I mean, the only one I've really skimmed through was The Running Man, and some of his short stories, where he used a fake name and then later published them in the anthology.
Dave, we can hear feedback coming from your computer.
Oh dear, what sort of feedback? You mean echoing back the stuff you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll fix that. You carry on.
But I do remember because the middle school, the only reason I really had a hard transition was I was just coming, it was the second Harry Potter hiatus.
Yep.
In the States. And I remember needed something to read because we had this atrocious reading program in middle school, which was you had to read a book, and then you had to take tests and get points. And the books used in this school used an arbitrary point system that made no sense because certain books were rated really high while other books that were just as hard were rated let's say one book was 400 pages long, it was rated 50 points. Another book just as long, but I guess because it was easier to read, was worth 10 points. And so it was this really weird and obnoxious program. Good.
I see. So what you're saying is like War and Peace would have been 10,000 points,
Yeah.
and like Harry Potter would have been 10 points.
Yep, pretty much. And I remember I needed something to read, and I had just finished reading Jurassic Park,
Hmm.
which is having seen the movie and then reading the book. Or there'll be like there's a point where the books where they follow each other and then they just do this. But um, but I needed something to read, and I'm just like, I've been meaning to get into Stephen King, so I'll use this as an excuse to actually convince myself to start reading his works. I picked up The Eyes of the Dragon, which was Stephen King's take on fantasy.
Hmm.
And it was all about bloodlines, politics, heirs to the throne, and murder.
So kind of like Game of Thrones.
Yes, except only 300 pages long. So it was surprisingly. From there, it was just basically like I started like I had required reading in English class, so we had to read like Beowulf, Grendel.
And did you have to read Beowulf in its original English?
No, our teacher said if we were to do that, he would basically be that would essentially because we had an exam at the end where we had to basically match the character to their house and quote. And he said that if he were to do it in the original English, we would have all failed the exam.
Fair enough.
But it was like the Scarlet Letter, the Crucible, the Glass Menagerie, a couple of really weird plays, a lot of Shakespeare. We had 3 months in my senior English class where we read nothing but Shakespeare, which thank God for that, because that was probably the most fun I had in an English class in forever.
But were you being serious or sarcastic?
No, I was being serious because our professor, or our teacher, he had audiobooks for all the Shakespeare, and they were fully acted audio dramas. And so we would actually sit there in class and read our copies of Shakespeare while he had the audio drama playing. And so it was basically us reading it, but also hearing it, and we were able to, like, there would be times where I was reading, I think it was Othello, and I could actually start to visualize the scene. And at the very end of each one, he'd be like, okay, today we're going to watch this adaptation. And so it was a lot of fun. And then we also read the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then once I got off to university, and I just didn't have much time to read what I wanted to read, except for during the summer.
Fair enough. Getting back to Jurassic Park, as is my understanding, have you read it, Dave?
No, never.
As is my understanding, it would have actually made a decent film as is. Like if
Yes.
they turned what was on the page, put that on the screen, that would have been fine. Partly why I don't like Hollywood adaptations, because the directors have to, quote, make it their own, which disgusts me.
Yeah.
People want to see on the screen what they read in the book.
Yeah.
I think that's partly why
Ian Malcolm.
Game of Thrones is so successful. Sorry, you're saying Ian Malcolm?
No, Ian Malcolm was more of an asshole in the book. I do remember that.
Mm-hmm.
He actually was a misogynist, if I remember correctly, because he was continually hitting on any woman that came within 5 feet of him.
Mm-hmm.
And then the doctor, like the lead character played by Sam Neill in the movie, he actually had a beard. And he was actually a much more older guy. He was a little bit older. And also John Hammond was a prick.
So John Hammond, the guy that runs the park.
Yes, he was a prick. They actually, he was a real nasty guy who basically was like, I did this just because I could, and all this. There was no, myth or dream about it. It was all, money all the way. And so that is one thing I'm glad they did change, because he was a really likable character until they got to the park.
Oh, okay. I see.
Also, the book is broken up into 7 interludes, each one with a
Okay.
different piece of chaos theory. Because the author, Michael Crichton, he
Yeah.
likes to put science. He likes to break up his books based upon scientific principles. Sphere was based on psychology, so it was broken up into parts based on like a psychological quotes, if I remember correctly. Um, Jurassic Park was broken up into chaos theory because that was the underlying theme of the book was chaos and
Would it
how a
work?
system.
Go. Just
No.
finish your train of thought.
Based.
Would it work better as a TV series?
Not really, because the book takes place over 3 days.
Mhm.
So what they did with the movie, if they would have had like an extra half hour to actually iron out like a few minor things, it would have been a lot better. But for what we got, it was actually not that bad. I mean, Crichton actually was a producer on the film, so anything they presented, I think they presented him with like, oh, we're changing this because we want to do this and we want to change this, and he was just like, you have my blessing, go right ahead. So
So I would never give Hollywood that power. Like, no, I wrote the book I wrote the book this way, the scene will go this way. Like, I could understand if they wanted to change some terribly minor things, like the words that come out of the mouths in a different order, but so long as they still had the same meaning at their core, that would be one thing.
Yeah.
But for them to change a scene because it works better for film, that can stuff off. Dave, you haven't said anything.
Hello. Well, I've been listening.
What was your transition from childhood to teenhood to adulthood?
Well, it's difficult to trace because I'm like Zach. I was taught to read very early. My mum and my dad's mum were primary school teachers, and so I was fluent at reading by the time I got to school. And I didn't have I had kind of the opposite of the experience you had, Zach, which was that when I got to school, same way, I was essentially the books that they had in the sort of first class area were basically too young for me. But I wasn't given something cool to read instead. I was given something extremely boring to read instead. They went, right, you're obviously ready for the older kids' books. There was a certain amount of reaching, trying to figure out something to give me to read, and I remember the teacher like taking me off to this dusty, unused area, and she was like, okay, try these. And she got me these books which I think actually we were given to read a couple of years later, but I'm not over sure. But they were really boring, and they were called Link Up, and they were it was obviously this reading system. I don't know why it was called Link Up, something to do with how they were supposed to be presented to us, I suppose. And they had this sort of list of characters in the front page, and it was just some kids, and they had a dog, and all I remember about the books is how boring they were and how much of a shame it was that I had to read them instead of the Big Toe, and like there were all these books that the kids my age were reading, which were much more fun, such as the Hungry Giant was my favorite one, and I got to read that out in front of the class. They had this reading system where you had a book, just a book-sized book, but then the teacher had a gigantic person-sized copy of the book that they would read from at the front of the class so everyone could see. And if you got to go up there and read out of that to the class, oh, that was a special day, and I did. But I can't. So as a result, I can't tell you what my sort of first book was. There was no such thing as that. I was eased in. I mean, I've said this before on the show, but my mum had this policy of she read a story to us every night. There was always a bedtime story, no matter what, and her philosophy for that was to read something above what we could read by ourselves, and so she was reading, so she was reading Narnia to me around the time I was starting school, because I don't think I was ready for that. I think I could probably have read it, but I don't think I would have stuck with it for the space of a book, So she was reading that to me then, and things like that. So as a result of that, yeah, there's a lot of books all at once, and I'm not sure which ones came when. I guess my transition to reading myself. No, that never happened either. I was always reading myself. So I guess my transition to reading more grown-up books myself would have been... I remember the first book I had trouble reading, and it was called... It was called something like Magic at Midnight, or something like that. And it was a children's book, and it was about, you know, talking owls and fairies and things. But I remember bringing it home and trying... I think the teacher gave it me as a challenge. And I remember bringing it home, and I couldn't understand half of the words. And so Mum sat down with me, and basically we wrote out a little glossary of what these words are. And I found it a few years ago, and it was interesting to read because it was, you know, it was things like naivety and subtlety, and it was sort of words that obviously, you know, they're not foreign to us now, but you can see why to a 6-year-old it was strange that anyone would put them into a children's book that's supposed to be read by children. But I respect it because, you know, I like that sort of thing. The fact that it ddid force me to sit down with a grown-up and sort of learn new words is a good thing. So I'm having trouble thinking of any standout things because I have always read a lot of books. I'm not a very fast reader now, but when I was a kid I used to plow through them quite quickly. So I guess instead I will just address what you were talking about a moment ago, which is Lord of the Rings. I am surprised still every time I hear someone say they read Lord of the Rings as a child, because it isn't interesting enough. That's not me. I'm not getting on Lord of the Rings. Like, I like Lord of the Rings, but it's after a few chapters, it stops doing anything for a long time that a child would engage with, I think. I'm obviously wrong because lots of children read it, or at least young teenagers.
Is there a retold children's version, I wonder?
No, there isn't. Well, there might be somewhere in the world, but it's not. There isn't one that I've heard of. But no, it's the real. I mean, who was it? Was it yourself, Zach, or was it Matty, or was it you, Ian? Someone here said that they read Lord of the Rings.
It was Matthew.
Yeah.
It was definitely Matty.
Yeah, I'll ask him about that when he comes in then, because it interests me. Because, I mean, The Hobbit, yeah. But I think Lord of the Rings, and I still find this as an adult, you know, it starts strong, and then very quickly it moves to... I can remember when I stopped reading it as a child. I got through the first book, happy with that. Second book was where it stopped working for me. It was just too much camping. I remember... The main thing I remember about Two Towers was walking and camping and the lay of the land, and I just remember thinking nothing happens in this book. And I wish I'd stuck with it, because I think I got to the end. And by the way, this was being read to me. Mum was reading this, and it's the only time I remember ever going, can we not? At the end of the second book, or rather at the end of Two Towers, I just remember going, right, I'm exhausted now. Can we have something else and maybe come back to this later? And we never came back to it. So I've actually still never read it all the way to the end. As an adult, I got the book, you know, around about when the third film was coming out. Still didn't get through to the end because Two Towers was such hard going. But I'll do it one day.
You see, that's why you need this speed reading software.
Yes,
so you can
that's right.
Power on through it.
Well, no, but you're right. But I don't hold with that, because when it comes to like reading information or books you don't care about, yeah. But when it comes to books, because the thing is, even though it can be gradual, the writing in Lord of the Rings is a very precisely honed instrument, and I do want to take it in. I do want to hear a kind of Ian McKellen voice slowly reading it in my ear, you know. So I think that's how I was reading it, and that's why reading it myself, it took me so long, because I was very laboriously and carefully going through the words, because there's just something interesting about them. They're not. You'd never get away with it now. If someone came to a publisher with that writing style now, they would say, no, it's not punchy enough. It's not interesting enough. But it's so deliberate, and it is an art form. It's not. There's nothing accidental about it. He's chiseled every single word, and doesn't make it engaging necessarily, but it does make it interesting, and it makes it fascinating. And so if you're in that mood, which you ought to be if you're going to read Lord of the Rings, and which I was when I tried to, it's worth picking through it slowly, but it does mean that it reduces your chances of getting to the end. It's certainly in my case, I found.
Well, in that case, if you don't want to speed read it, you could always just get the audiobook.
Yeah, I get it. That depends on who's reading it.
Well, yeah, that's true. Apparently, some audiobooks they get like they hire a full cast and everything, like the Doctor Who audiobooks. They actually get the correct cast.
Those aren't audiobooks. Those are essentially radio dramas that you have to buy on CD. Yeah. They're not adapted from books, as far as I'm aware. However, you're right. Some rare, wonderful audiobooks do that. The only one I know off by heart. I don't mean I've listened to it and know it off by heart. I mean the only one I can pick off the top of my head that's done this is his Dark Materials. There was a good set of audiobooks of that. We had the first one on tape, and I don't mean we as children. I mean me and Abby somewhere in this flat have it on tape, and it's that is read by the author, but with full cast, and as far as I know, unabridged. So it's so essentially he just reads out the text, and then whenever anyone speaks, that's an actor. Plus there's background music and sound effects. I think that's just a brilliant way of doing it. I'd like to see more audiobooks done that way, because there's only a few people, and and they get a lot of work. Martin Jarvis is one of them. There's a lot of the classics are read by Martin Jarvis because he can do enough different voices convincingly and switch between them and keep it engaging that he can carry a book, and that's the first name that comes to mind. I'm sure there are plenty of others that do the same thing. But yeah, to do an audiobook, a whole audiobook with a full cast. I'm, by the way, doing this right now. I'm currently recording an audiobook for an audiobook company, and it's a very interesting thing to do because you do have to, well, I was going to say keep a lot of different character voices in your head. I have not been successful at that and have to keep looking them up in previous chapters and see, what they sounded like. But and I imagine that there's always heavy editing, and I imagine that's probably how even the best ones do it. But yeah, audiobooks they're an interesting beast because essentially they're mostly abridged, and so you have to, even with books that have an unabridged audio version, you sometimes tend to have to hunt for that and pay 50 quid or whatever. Like I say, it's quite a lot, and if they're not read by an engaging author. Reader, actor, whatever, then there's just no point. But then there are some audiobooks where the audiobook is the best version. And the only one I can think of off the top of my head for that is the Alan Partridge book, which came out a couple of years ago, and of course is read by, Alan Partridge, in character, Alan Partridge. And it's just a wonderful piece of comedy that's, I don't know why anyone would buy the book version of it when you can listen to it actually read by Alan Partridge.
Mm-hmm. I had some children's books, I may still have them, though, are Star Wars children's audiobooks. Yeah. But they were actual books accompanied by a tape. Read by one man, and to the very best of his ability, he did the character voices, but I noticed he also did... there were sound effects over his voices to make him sound more like Darth Vader or C-3PO. Yeah. Because the selling point of these books was, read by whoever, starring R2-D2 as himself.
Yes.
So
yes, that's an old trick because of course R2-D2 is just a series of beeps that they can play. But yeah.
Yes, but I thought I refound it again when I was a teenager. I'm like, hang on, did they actually get the actual actors? I think they may have actually
probably got Anthony Daniels. He'll do anything C-3PO in. I bet he read a couple of them out.
Yeah, because when you hear Darth Vader, it sounds a lot like Darth Vader, but not quite like Darth Vader. It's like, oh, that's someone doing a Darth Vader impression with the voice, whatever they do to make Darth Vader sound like Darth Vader.
Did you ever hear the radio dramas of Star Wars? Those are interesting.
I did not. Are they original, or are they the Star Wars story retold?
It's the Star Wars story retold. What it is, it's half-hour episodes, and the first series is the most interesting one. After that, it kind of trails off a bit. But basically extremely extended to the. I think the first one lasts like 6 hours, and they've used every cutscene, everything that didn't make it into the film, and then they've expanded it more. So, like, the first, I think, 2 or 3 episodes, which is, an hour and a half, happens leading up to the film even starting. And so you've got all this stuff about, like, how Leia and her father found out about the Death Star in the first place and ended up with the plans and getting on the ship. And so, really, really interesting. And they've got quite a bit of the real cast to do it. And then everyone else is fine. And it starts to sort of tail off a bit as the series goes on, just because it's not quite as extended anymore, or it's not quite as interesting how much more they're putting into it. It's not an audiobook in any sense, so I shouldn't really be talking about it this week, but it's well worth
That's all right. It's still sort of
up. Yeah. The interesting casting point is that
there's two Zachs.
Yes, there's 2 Zachs. Hello, both Zachs. Are one of you Matty?
No, my internet decided to...
So the other one will kill itself soon, in a
Yes.
not gruesome way, we hope. The interesting casting decision is that by the time you get to the... I think it's in the second. I think it's in Empire, but it might just be in Jedi. But I think it's in Empire. They get John Lithgow in to do Yoda, and I don't know why, but it works.
Huh.
Oh, John Lithgow is Yoda.
Yeah,
That's an interesting casting choice.
doing a Yoda voice. Yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly who came up with that idea, but it's fascinating. Anyway, so there we go. So that's completely irrelevant to today's discussion. So, drawing it round just a bit, I'd like to mention, since we're talking about books, I cannot last a book episode of a nerdy podcast without bringing up Revenge of the Sith. I've mentioned it on the podcast before. I mentioned it on the podcast before today. But it's the one Star Wars book I've ever read, including the Thrawn ones, that really ever stuck with me as a good book, like a really good book. And no one reads it because they go, well, the prequel films were rubbish. I'm not going to read books based on the prequel films, and that's a perfectly reasonable stance. However, the novelization of Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover is great, and kind of does for Revenge of the Sith, and indeed the entire prequel trilogy, what the radio drama does for that first film. It kind of takes it, expands it, puts motivation in where motivation wasn't. So do you remember in the original Star Wars, there's that guy who's the chap who Vader Force chokes, who's going, yeah, your religion, the Force isn't real, and Vader chokes him. He gets this whole story in the radio drama where he's trying to talk Moff Tarkin into making a power play, and hey, if you just stay the course, he's sort of Grima worm-tonguing him. If you just stay the course, you can have all the real power. And at first you think, where are they going with this? But then you realize that it's the reason why, when the Death Star blows up, Tarkin is still on board, going in that last second before it explodes. They make that a whole story. It's because instead of evacuating like everyone else who's aware that it's under attack by a sizable force would want to do, he's like, no, I'm going to stay here. And if I stay here, yeah, we found out there's this tiny flaw in the schematics, but if I stay here, I might be able to inherit this power one day. And, just things like that. They've put extra little character motivations in where they're not needed on film because you've got, you know, I can't remember his name now, the chap who plays Tarkin, but you've got his face, you know, tells you everything you need to know. Yes, Peter Cushing. He's just, you can just look at him all day and you don't need any more information really. But yeah, things like that interest me, and so the novelization of Revenge of the Sith. Anyone out there who has even the vaguest interest in like the prequel trilogy or just Darth Vader, like I think that if there'd been no prequel trilogy and somehow Matthew Stover had written this book, it would, no one would need a prequel trilogy. Nobody would need any more information about who Darth Vader is. It's a great backstory for the character, and the reason it's so fascinating is that he was very clearly given the screenplay and then given carte blanche not to use it, and he doesn't use it. There's about 2 lines in the entire book that come from the film, and they're great lines, and then the rest of it he just sort of takes the meaning of the dialogue and completely changes it, as if the screenplay was his earliest notes on what book to write. So yeah, if that sounds interesting to anyone, you will be satisfied. So go and get it and read it.
I got the copies of the books and I'm going through them, and it is extremely well written. I thought, hang on, I'm going to go back and read part 2, just to see. And episode 2 is really, there's just more in it. Like, it actually tells you when Anakin's mother, the story behind it, shows you her getting kidnapped.
Mm-hmm.
When it actually catches up to the movies, it's basically the same scene for scene, just with more words, if you know what I mean. It's like, you know what the characters are thinking on top, and how they're feeling on top of what they're saying, and their motivations for doing what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Yeah, I'll have to have a look into that. It never really occurred to me to... oh, no, it did. It did occur to me to read the other 2. But I didn't get very far into the first one. Rather, you know... what's the first prequel called again? Episode 1. What's that called?
Phantom Menace.
I didn't get very far into that. It was kind of interesting, but the thing about the Matthew Stover one is that I just really liked the actual writing, which I didn't connect with so much in Phantom Menace. So, but yeah, so the second one's good as well, is it?
It's not particularly... I find that the third one, how far I've gotten through it, the writing, it's very, I guess you might call it high English. It's very proper, very regal, the way it's presented. The second one is just presented in very plain English. So it's not good, it's just fuller. It's just a fuller story.
Yeah.
Experience, just written in straight ordinary English.
Yeah, and what I find, because I'm interested in novelizations. I am. I don't read a lot of them, but I'm interested in them because I just like, and old ones particularly, I like the idea of a film that I'm completely used to.
Yeah.
And then a book based on it, written by someone who hasn't seen the film, and just has like the film they were trying to make at the time in mind. Yeah, that's really interesting. And we already talked in a previous one about the novelization of the original Star Wars film. And that has, you know, scenes that ended up being deleted scenes, some of which are in the radio drama, and you have this whole story with is it Biggs? Is it Wedge? What the guy that Luke used to be friends with, and then he ends up seeing him again right at the end of the film. But in the film, you don't know that they used to know each other particularly.
Oh, because there is that part. Oh, sorry. I have the painting book that has the script in it, and it has that bit earlier on in the film, you know, but I wanted to go to my friends to the Power Stoshi station or whatever it is. In this original script, he does. He does eventually get there, and there's a whole scene with them there.
Yeah, that's the stuff I mean. So that's in the radio drama, and it's in the book, and so like now and then, I'll end up with an old novelization. I remember, the only one I got when it was actually new was the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man film, and that was
wait,
good.
There's a novelization of that?
Yeah, yeah, and this was because in the old days, and the reason why they're more interesting then is that like in those days they didn't. So like about 1985 and earlier, any film that came out then, the novelization was because they frankly didn't expect anyone to be able to buy it on video. They didn't know that was either they didn't know that was even going to happen, or they couldn't guarantee it. So novelization would be a way of allowing people to take home, something that they otherwise could have only ever seen the once in their life. And then of course video took that over, and the novelization kind of fell out of favor. But now when they make them, it's as a promotional thing. The Revenge of the Sith one was mostly existed so that people could essentially buy it a week before the film came out and say that, oh, I know the story before anyone else, or whatever. It was just a marketing tool. And the same is true for the Spider-Man one, presumably. But when you get someone on board who does want to write a good book, it can be interesting. And the Spider-Man one, I can't remember how good a book it is, but I get the sense that he was at least, it was Peter David, and he was at least having fun writing it. And it was sufficiently fleshed out. And again, I don't know to what extent this is from the original screenplay and what of it was just made up by Peter David. Sorry, I'm having to navigate my elbow around my mic stand. But it was sufficiently fleshed out that when I saw the film, I found it empty and lacking, and didn't like it really. And I think, and I do like the Amazing Spider-Man films, and people are always going, well, how can you when the Raimi ones exist? And I think that might be why. I think it's that, I might have spoiled it by reading the book first, which certainly I would have done if I'd read Revenge of the Sith before I saw the film. The book is much better, far and away, than the film.
Can you get novelizations of all of the current Spider-Man films? Do you know?
Well, I haven't heard of any for the Amazing Spider-Man films. I think there may have been one for Spider-Man 2. No, I think there was, because I think I saw it in the comic shop around the time that the film was coming out. I'll tell you what there was one for Transformers. And in fact, it was written by the guy who did the original Star Wars one, whose name eludes me for the moment. It's a triple name. He's really famous. He's really, really famous, and he does science fiction books and lots of science fiction novelizations. He does. Well, I mentioned his name before whenever we were talking about it before. Yeah, he did. He did the Transformers movie, and presumably made it into something resembling a story with.
Yeah. Which the movie certainly wasn't.
Well, to be fair on it, the first one was closer than any of the rest. So goodness knows whether he did any further ones or not.
Novelizations.
But now, speaking of, since we're supposed to be talking about books rather than novelizations, I'm gonna bridge the gap a little bit. Mm-hmm. That wasn't fair to novelization writers. I've already said that I like them, and to say books rather than novelizations. But you know what I mean. To bridge the gap a bit, I'm trying to think what the most famous novelizations must be. And
novelizations are still books.
Well, indeed.
Yeah. Sorry. Continue. Sorry.
Well, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That is thought of as a novel, especially by Americans, and it's not. It's a novelization by the writer of the original. So it counts as a novel in its own right. But it's I guess it surprises me how, despite Hitchhiker being such nerd currency, there seem to be quite a few people out there who have heard the radio series or even acknowledge its existence and kind of think of the book as the real thing. Any Hitchhiker fans out there who've yet to listen to the radio series, for goodness sake, go and do it, because you haven't experienced Hitchhiker yet. You're one of those, are you, Zach?
My intro to Hitchhikers was at 11 p.m. when I was 8 years old, and one of our local public, we have this channel called the PBS, Public Broadcasting Station.
Uh-huh.
And they were airing at 11 p.m. one night the BBC miniseries of Hitchhiker's Guide.
Well, not even
that was my
miniseries.
intro.
That's the length of a normal series in the UK.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they advertise it as the miniseries over here, but saw that, and then basically the process went from that to, oh yeah, my dad's like, oh yeah, it's based off of there's a book. I'm like, you're telling me that this hilarious thing, there's a book for it? And somewhere upstairs, I actually have on a bookshelf the 5-in-1 edition that they released. But continue. But
well, I was no purist at the time. I came to it. I think I remember what happened actually. I read again. I didn't read. My mum read to me the book, actually, there's all sorts to say about Hitchhiker, so maybe some other week when we're running out of more general topics, we'll talk about that. But
yes.
yeah, she was and she would do all the voices and everything, and so like I was getting quite a good idea of what it went like, and then towards the end, she got me the video, so I'd actually seen the whole series before we quite finished the first book, so I was surprised to find that it actually cuts off about halfway through. It wasn't until quite a bit later, when I was about, 14, that I finally heard the radio series. And now, I've got the box set of the CDs now. But so, in retrospect, just getting my newly heated up tea, a bit too hot to drink. The radio version, probably still the best, the best way of doing it. And the way I kind of wish I'd done it is to hear the radio series and then read the book to get the full story. But the radio series, man, it's so good. Anyone out there, get on it, listen to it, because because of course the characters, particularly Arthur Dent, was literally written for the man. Like it was written as the man who plays him in the radio series and in the TV series. That is the correct Arthur Dent. But there you go. That's an example of a book that essentially is thought of as a book, but is in fact a novelization of a radio series. Because again, slightly erroneously, in those days, a lot of different things like radio series and TV series and so on used to get novelizations because people couldn't tape them. The irony there being that Hitchhiker's Guide happened just as all the students got their first tape recorders and became kind of, an extremely taped off the radio thing, and that really helped. That honestly was where quite a lot of its popularity came from, and helped to turn it into what it is now. Anyway, books.
Piracy. You've gone on to piracy there. Piracy is the thing that the big media moguls at the top who live in the ivory towers don't understand it is. They're making more money because of piracy than they would be if it wasn't for piracy.
Well, because some people recognize that, or
I think the music industry were the first to click, like, hang on, we can make money off this. They go all online and just lower the prices, and Hollywood is still yet to figure that out, because they're still charging, $30 for a digital download when you can go get it on DVD for $30. So.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think that when the argument about sort of piracy versus not piracy comes up, I think a lot of what's sort of skewing that argument is that there's piracy, and then there's like where people would pay for everything, and then
there's how much everything actually costs.
Yeah. It's not so much the discrepancy isn't between pay or don't pay. The discrepancy is between pay a significant, frightening amount of the money you have. A percentage of the money you have that you can't really justify spending on a single film that will last a couple of hours of your life, versus not doing that and being able to eat for a week. It's I think because I think that there's an argument going on now about games, the price of games, because basically, for the longest time, you could expect to pay sort of £40 for a game here. I don't know what it's like elsewhere. And Steam comes out. Steam comes out and goes, right, yeah, we're still charging you that amount, but when they get old, if you wait for a sale, and we'll do a few of them every year, you can buy games for under a £5. And since that happened, maybe once or twice in the last 4 years have I ever bought a game for more than £7 around that. And as a result of that, there's now this argument going on, which is like, okay, so we all love Steam, we all love, and now PSN sales and things like that. But is it ruining the industry? Is it, if nobody will pay more than this for a thing that takes a hell of a lot of production? Do we lose the games that have a hell of a lot of production? And of course, the response that's coming from the indie game side is, well, then just don't spend that amount on production. Make good games instead of flashy-looking ones. And anyway, that's now starting to leak into the books world, where it's a lot more of an interesting question, because books aren't very expensive to begin with, and yet now an ebook, anyone can afford an ebook. And yet, there is, allegedly, I'm not really into this world, so I don't know much about it, but I'm hearing complaints from people who are, that there's now a lot of ebook piracy, and it's causing a problem. And of course, we are watching bookshops shut down, but that's because of the ability to buy books on Amazon and so on. That's not really ebooks particularly, but it's a factor. Have either of you got an ebook reader?
I have a ebook reader, but I don't particularly. It's a laser something. It's one of those multi-format ones. It's just a generic ebook reader, but it turns pages too slowly. So I actually just use my phone because I've got Google Play Books, and I can get all the different e-reader software on the one device. Yeah. Including the speed reading software for speed reading through my EPUB files. But getting onto that, see, until very recently, an ebook was almost the same price as a regular book, if not just a little bit less. Sometimes it was actually more. It's like, why would I buy the ebook when that's less, including shipping? And
you know what? And in that case, much of what I was just rambling on about, I'm actually quite uninformed on, as people who are informed on it will have been shouting at their screens. So yes, I ought to admit that I'm not really a purchaser of ebooks, and the ones, when I said that anyone can afford them, I'm more or less thinking of books sold by their authors, indie, just people I've heard of who are writing and selling their own books. Actually, I don't know anything about the pricing of sort of, big name ebooks.
Well, I think a lot of the people have kicked up a stink because they, hang on, $19.95 for a physical copybook, that's one thing. But if all I'm downloading is essentially the PDF version of that, why would I be paying even $9.95 for that? I should be paying $1.99.
Now we're back onto the same argument that's being had with games. I feel guilty about this, but I'm in that camp. If I'm going to download an ebook, if I'm going to buy an ebook, I'm going to want to pay less than a £5 for it, because if I'm paying £5, I can get the paperback for less than that, and I like paperbacks more than I like digital books. So, so what I'll do in that situation is I'll go onto Amazon Marketplace and I'll get the one that's 1p plus shipping. Yeah. There's always a copy of any paperback that is. And so I'm killing the industry, of course. And the problem being that a book, as anyone who's tried to write one knows, takes a gigantic amount of your life. I'm not a published writer, so I don't know this, but certain writers, chief among them seems to be John Green, will tell you that the eventual writing of a book is not just done by the author, as many of us sort of might go into it assuming, but there's a lot of work put into the book by things like editors and agents, such that they sometimes, depending on the book, perhaps ought to have not necessarily equal, but certainly billing on the front cover. So the point is there's a lot of work goes into writing books. A lot. Somewhere out there, for any novel you read that's well written, the author essentially put aside everything else in their life for maybe years to produce that. And so to give them, to chuck 20 quid into a bucket for them doesn't seem like, enough of a contribution. And yet, I think it's a question of quantity. It's the same as with games. It's the same as with films. Essentially, when we buy a film, gone are the days when I'd be prepared to spend, upwards of 20 quid for a DVD. Those days existed when it was, an amazing format and so on. But or it was a film that I've loved all my life, and of course I would still spend that if it's a film I've loved all my life and can't get any other way. But the fact that a film will only take a couple of hours of your life, the fact that a game will only take a couple of weeks of your life, the fact that a book, I don't know, maybe a couple of months, however long it takes you to read. But the point is, we need, both to keep up with culture and just to feel satisfied, we need loads of books, we need loads of games, we need loads of films, and I think that's why we bulk at prices over £5. We look at it and we go, well, how many £5 have I actually got? I need loads of these. We have lost Zach. See you in a moment,
seems
Zach.
so. But here's the thing. Yes, it takes up that person's many years of that person's life, and also the editor and whoever else.
Yeah.
Put there in it. But you see, there's this came out of a factory.
Mm-hmm.
There's paper. There was printing costs, shipping costs, international shipping costs, and that's what's being whittled at. That's why I don't think a digital version of this book should cost the same amount as this book.
That's true as well, but there's an extra point to add to that, which is that, as far as I know, I'm probably wrong on this because I don't work in any of these fields, but as far as I understand it, the price of a book is way above what it costs to make, much with a DVD. The actual, if you were just paying for the disc and the plastic of the box, it would be about £1. If that. Mainly what you're paying for is essentially the cost that the book shops require for shelf space. At least that's, as I understand, that's how it is in the magazine world. There was a comic that I thought was a wonderful thing, but that couldn't sell in shops because of the price that takes, to get onto shelves in places like W.H. Smith's, which is at the time the shop that you needed to be on the shelf of to sell a wide-reaching comic. Luckily, they're now back in business again and are doing well, but the point is, shelf cost does drive certain things out of business, and so presumably there's something similar going on with books, and that's part of what the asking price is. Although maybe it is more to do with materials, because a hardback book costs a ridiculous amount of money that I would essentially never pay for a book compared to the paperback version. But then, no, a bit of cardboard for a cover won't be that expensive. It will be just prestige. It'll be because it's a brand new book and it looks nicer and things like that. So anyway, there's obviously all sorts of factors going into it. But the thing, and this is true of all of the other mediums as well, games and videos and music and all of it. And I think that essentially now, as we the public are starting to twig to the idea that yes, work went into this, but what we're paying for, or I'd say twig to, it's not a fact we're realizing. It's an opinion that people are moving towards. So it could swing either way. But I think as opinion moves towards, well, we're only paying for the bytes of data, or we're paying for, as you say, the physical pages or whatever. That is when prices must go down for anyone to be prepared to pay them. And once they've gone down, is that them down forever? And I think that's probably a bit of a crisis that certainly the book market is having. I'm hearing quite a bit from my friends who are into this or who work in it, saying that yes, there's some sort of a crisis going on in the publishing world about how to get people to buy books anymore. And meanwhile, however, as with indie gaming, there is a whole other world going on off to one side, and I'm starting to read articles by established authors who are stepping away from the publishing racket, as it were. I say that in a kind way. The publishing industry, finding that they can make money without having to take any of it off and give that to the publishers or whoever by publishing online themselves. And there's this whole world which I only found out about fairly recently. There's a chap called Garrett Robinson who's interesting because he's got a YouTube channel in which he is literally writing a novel on YouTube. Well, I think he does it. I think he does it on Google Hangouts or the YouTube equivalent, and then publishes the videos to YouTube. But he's calling it Vlogger Novel, and he he screen shares as he writes his novel. So he's got his copy of Scrivener open. He's literally writing the novel before your eyes. If you're a Patreon subscriber, and if not, then you get to see it later on. Oh, hi again, Zach. And then he's publishing these as sort of ebooks, chapter by chapter, or you can subscribe to them or buy the full thing later. And by following that through, plus he makes interesting videos, so he's worth a look. Following that through, I then found out that he is, in kind of various little writing groups or does podcasts or whatever with other writers who are doing the same thing. And suddenly I realized there's this whole world now of online publishing, which is like, it's tempting to incorrectly look at sort of self-publishing online as a bit of play, as a bit of fun, sort of the equivalent of fanfic writing or whatever. But it's not. Get into it, and there are good authors who are writing their books and publishing them for a pittance online, or so little money that you just might as well. Plus, they sometimes have deals. Like for example, Garrett Robinson has this thing. If I remember this correctly, this might not be the case, but where the first chapter is free if you write a review, or maybe the first chapter isn't, but if you write a review, then the second one is free, or something like that. So, but they'll come up with little offers because, of course, they're in control of it. They can do what they want. And it encourages people to read. And it's just really interesting, both as, to find things to read and to look at as ways maybe to get your own writing seen, if you're into that. Because there's a new world of publishing that's starting to rise in response to the old model falling perhaps out of favor a bit, and new ideas, just new possibilities. These are things that I imagined, and that I think we all imagined when the internet was a new thing. Like, well, now the world changes and we can all share. Books will be digital and films will be digital, and we won't have to go to the cinema anymore, and we won't have to go to a bookshop anymore. And of course, when we were dreaming these things, we didn't think about how that would impact people's jobs and things we might really like. But it's interesting and it's worth looking at, and so that's happening now. There's indie book things going on just the same as there is indie game things going on.
Yeah, but here's the thing: independent publishing, if you get published through the more traditional method through a publisher, then it's then up to them to promote and advertise and whatnot. But if it's on you, then it's all up to you to promote and advertise your own work. So
that's exactly right.
You might have the best book in the world, but if you're not getting noticed, then
yeah, that's exactly right. And I feel as if there's going to be a solution to that soon. I feel as if, think of this. Imagine if you, and I'm not bashing publishers. I don't personally think that that's a dead thing and that we shouldn't pay attention to it anymore, and at all. I don't think that. But one of the things that they do is, you get an agent, you get representation. They then find you a publisher. The publisher then, as you say, they have a huge amount of budget that goes on to promoting the book. And some do this better than others. I'm sure we've all heard about examples of writers who were not really given a lot of. I think maybe these days easier if you're already an established name in some other field. You know, there's a lot of people who are already famous who then will write a book, or if you're already an established author. But you can kind of see their point there. So, okay. But I wonder whether the chunk... Imagine the complete sales of a book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And presumably most of that goes to the publisher. It's not going to be like 90% of that or even 50% of that goes to the author. It's probably, I mean, it's probably almost none of it. It's an advance and then, in many cases, presumably nothing else. But maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, but there, well, yes, there's supposed to be royalties if you have a royalties arrangement. So that's, you know, I don't know. But anyway, think of what the percentage of that is compared to making 100% of the money because you wrote and published it yourself. Well, assuming that it's a book that's got enough of a following that the money that the person could make off the book is like, I don't know, the same as an advance that they might get from a publisher. I guess that's when it becomes worth it. Anyone who then can go a bit beyond that and can make some more money, the money, what I'm leading to is the money they might spend on hiring a publicist to make, or a company who can advertise this. Would it be, is an indie version of that going to start to appear that makes it worth doing, and it still skims off, you know, an equivalent amount that a publisher would, or, you know what I mean, something like that, that would make
Something
it worth
like,
doing? I'd be interested to look out for that.
Something like Google AdWords, you mean? Where you could put your novel on a website and use Google AdWords to pay, okay, I'm going to pay $10 a day to advertise this book and have ad supports on my book.
Yes, although the problem with that is that everyone, it's the same as with YouTube advertising, everyone is now savvy to the fact that you can switch adverts off, and they don't do a lot anyway. I think a much better way of... I mean, look, I've already mentioned him before, but probably the person who's best publicizing their own books right now is John Green. Now, he's got publishers, he doesn't need to do that, but the fact that this is a guy who is equally, arguably more famous simply for vlogging on YouTube than, or as much as for writing, you know, it's as much a part of who he is and what his job is. That's someone who has just completely taken charge of essentially publicizing himself, seemingly effortlessly and in a quite open and genuine way. It's not going to be as easy as that for everybody, but gosh, getting yourself... See, now that we're in this YouTube age, getting yourself known, no matter what your other art is, whatever it is you do, getting yourself known is a big deal. And one of the ones I've been thinking about recently is Maisie, what's name from Game of Thrones, who the girl who plays Arya Stark, who since
Maisie.
Game of Thrones, has recently sort of started building up her online persona, and loads of people follow her on Twitter, and she does the Teens React To videos now, and I feel as if like, and she's doing well at that, like she's likable in those, and everyone likes them. So I feel as if like if Game of Thrones now, if somehow she'd been able to do that without Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones came out now, and they cast Maisie Williams as Arya Stark, everyone would go, perfect! That's a great idea. And that's, you know, of course she came out of Game of Thrones and used that and so on. But what I mean is, if someone could publicize themselves in that way, just themselves, not even their work, it helps, and it, you know, it works as a lead-in. So that works for publishing to an extent. You know, we've seen it work for John Green. I'm guessing there are a few other people it's working for, but I don't know them, so who knows how well it's working. But it's interesting, and it's worth thinking about. And I was thinking less about things like AdWords and more about literally publicists actually hiring a person who knows about advertising to do that. Maybe that'll become a thing soon. Maybe it's a thing now, and they're so good at it that we don't know.
You mean like an agent who does the groundwork for you?
Yeah, I guess, but I mean in a in a way that
advertising
isn't talking to
way.
publishers and is more, in a more internet-y, modern-y sort of a way. And again, please don't think I'm bashing agents and publishers and things. It's just sort of, it's all interesting. And the fact that there are so many new ways into it now means that for readers like us, there's more. There's more ways, there's more to find, and it's more interesting. And yes, we are sadly losing what we once had, which is the ability to essentially walk into a bookshop and just browse. But that was never quite good enough on its own. You know, I mean, how many books have we all bought? You know, obviously, the phrase, you know, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, the fact is that essentially until recently, that's all we could do. It really was... I mean, yeah, you could, if you had a newspaper that happened to have reviewed the book you were looking for, you know, then that's one thing. But now, you're in a bookshop, you're looking at a book, it looks pretty good, you go on Goodreads, and you can look at all the user reviews there, same as, you know, as you can with films, look up their Rotten Tomatoes reviews or whatever it is you happen to look up. The difference being that, well, see, the problem is oh, hi, mate, you're still judging a book by its cover then, aren't you? If you're in the shop, you go, oh, that looks interesting, I'll look up reviews for that. You're still...
I have a philosophy for getting books. You get the book, it has an interesting cover, you read the blurb on the back, and then you just flick through and read some random pages like, okay, this is my kind of book.
Well, mine was, and I still do this, I always read the first paragraph, because firstly, it gives you a sense of the writing, but secondly, it's kind of the bit that they paid them... The writer is always very careful with the first paragraph to make sure it's representative of the book as a whole, and often to sort of, you know, hide little references to the rest of the story in it and so on. So it's always a nice little snapshot. Talking about books, judging books by their cover, there was actually quite a significant book in my teen years that we were talking about the transition from, like, you know, teen reading to adult reading or whatever, and that was Time by Stephen Baxter. Abby next to me just gave a big groan and a face because I've been trying to get her to read this for nigh on 15 years. And it's a book. The cover was so beautiful. Do you know what? I'll talk about this in a minute. Matty, tell us about books. I'll go and get Time while you tell us about yours, because you've missed all the introductions and the early memories bit.
Yeah, just to bring Matty up. Yeah, sorry, just to bring you up to speed, we've done the typical sin that then we've started talking about like book production and e-books versus physical books and such, and that's what we were on to now. Anyway, go, your earliest memories.
Earliest memories. My earliest memory of a book was before I could read, and it's not really a memory, it's a memory of people telling me a story of when I was young. And it involves the Transformers and audiobooks. And you were able to purchase little short stories in little skinny books with an accompanying audio tape. And I love this story so much, and it remained in my possession until well into my early 20s. And it was a story about, I don't know, they were stealing electricity to make energon cubes. But I'd listened to the story on the cassette tape, and it had the little ding noise when you turn the page.
Yep.
And I'd done this so often that at a family gathering, I'd run around showing all the family members how well I could read. And this is, well before I could possibly have had the faculties to handle such a task, because I knew exactly when to turn the page. I memorized all the story. So to all intents and purposes, to an outsider, I was reading this book before I even had a fully formed soft palate and everything, top palate. So that's my earliest memories of book. But I have a fundamental life-altering story about a book, and it explains why I'm clinically blind almost. My father gave me 100th anniversary hardback edition of The Lord of the Rings as a 6-year-old boy, because that's what you do to 6-year-old children. And being a 6-year-old...
Matty, let me just tell you this. We've been talking a bit about Lord of the Rings, and one of the things that I was saying that I'm really interested to hear you address now is that, like, I am amazed by the concept of a child reading Lord of the Rings. So tell me about that.
Well, it's interesting, and everybody has the same reaction, but I think you've got to come at it from the point of view of if you give let's say you give a person a bowl of sour cream and you tell them that it is sweet, they will continue forever associating that tingling sensation at the back of their tongue as being sweet. So for a 6-year-old boy handed this book, no one said, "Oh, that's such a hard book," or "Oh, that's full of complicated names and slow plots," and it was just a huge pile of paper with print, and I dutifully read every single word, and it took me almost 6 months. And I did. I mean,
it would take me that now. Never mind 6 years old. That would take. I was just saying to them earlier that as a kid, I got through, and this was with it being read to me. I got to the end of Two Towers and couldn't go any further. As an adult, you know, in the wake of the films, I bought the book. Well, no, I got it for Christmas. I had the book, and I read it, loved it, had a really nice time with it. Still gave up after Two Towers just because of how low it is.
I guess my background is I started piano lessons when I was 5, so I'd already had at that age a considerable portion of my life being taught discipline, sit and do until finished.
Yeah,
no question. Yeah. I wasn't brought up with cartoons and television. I was in a very strict, rather boring household, really. Not an academic household, just a very boring household, and I learned patience at a very young age. So it wasn't a big deal, and I continued to read it, and I held on to that edition of the book until I was probably about 21 when I returned it to my father, barely intact, and I used to cart it around under my arms at high school. You know, it's huge hardcover, all 3 books in one. No one had any idea what it was. Even at the age of 15, I still didn't understand the implications of my fascination with this tome of work. Yeah. And to date, I've read it over 20 times.
Wow.
And somewhere there is a soft cover that still has the dog ear from when I last picked it up and read a bit and you put it down. And it's just been a continuing thing of my life. It's always been around. But, I mean, the names, the places, I couldn't pronounce them, but I could recognize the stream of letters. And, that's that guy. Don't ask me to say his name, but that's that guy. And they're at that place. And that kind of thing. And I was fascinated with the songs. There were songs in this book. I'm like, this is the best thing ever made by a human, book or movie or otherwise. So, but yeah, I think it was an ignorance of the task in front of me that enabled me to just incorporate it into my daily life.
And you never felt that that drag in, as I say, towards in Two Towers, where it really is a lot of camping and hills and lay of the land stuff.
I think, and this is probably a reflection of my own personality, but I reread pages because I enjoyed them, and I still do. And a lot of the things that I enjoyed were his enormously elaborate descriptions of a field of daisies. You know, where most writers would just go and they crest the hill and before them lay a wash of daisies, green pointed with blah, blah, blah. He would spend 3 pages talking about what it represented, and it was fantastic. And I would often reread pages again, just going, oh, this is brilliant. I could just sit here like this all day and just...
I have a question for you, Matty. You said you had the omnibus edition, so it was all 3 books or 6 books if you want to get technical in one. So, as a child, were you separating them as the 3 books, or was it to you was it just one book?
It was just a giant story, and I'm not sure whether it was the first time I read it, but the appendices. This was the first edition that contained the full, now infamous appendices, and even those.
Is this the green hardback with the quite flowery cover, similar to the famous Hobbit one?
It is, but I quickly removed the dust cover, and obviously it's just the brown with the Tolkien gold embossed logo on it, which I thought was the greatest thing ever, and subsequently began... I mean, I was one of those kids who I designed my own logo, I created my own language, Started writing my own epic stories without any concept of a subculture or of other people who were into this kind of stuff. No one I knew gave two hoots about Lord of the Rings, really. I was all alone, and I just thought everyone did stuff like that. So, yeah. And speaking of books by covers, really quickly, that association with that book has led me to, I always go for really monochrome color or earthy tone books with very little imagery on them. I'd take the dust covers off books straight away. I love that idea of it just being the faux leather or vinyl or whatever they've particularly used. And so I don't judge books by covers unless they have an awesome old school hand leather bound cover, and I'm just like, I don't care what that book is. If it's a dictionary, I'll still read it because it looks good.
Well, I've gone and got it now. So this is the book that I judged by its cover.
Ooh.
And it's very simple teenage mind thing. It's shiny. It's got this ring on it, which I discovered was some sort of time portal. The word time is shiny and stuff. It's a very simple sort of. It just hit my senses. But I was looking for a science fiction book. I realized like every science fiction book I'd ever read, and also Lord of the Rings, had been borrowed from my parents' sort of book wall, and so I wanted my own sci-fi book, and I was just rooting through the shop, and I found this. And sure enough, it turned out to have the content I was looking for. The actual book itself sort of lived up to what I was imagining. Much as last week I was saying that the Popeye game on the Spectrum lived up to what I imagined from the blurb on the back. This is just it's a book about, some people find this in space, and it's a ring that you can, if you go through it, you go forwards in time. Then, if you go back through it, you go forwards in time, and that's the premise. And it says on the back that it has, where is it? Time has one of the best time jump sequences ever attempted, during which the protagonists witness the entire future of the universe. And sure enough, that delivers. And it's now Stephen Baxter he's a sci-fi writer who. He is for, I didn't know this at the time, and I didn't know what I was getting into. He's mainly for like hard science fiction fans. Essentially, the plot and characters take a backseat to the science in his books. So if you're in it for these days, I don't know if I would have got through it the way I did, because now I want the characters to be the standout thing, or maybe the things that are happening. In this though, what it does, and what any Stephen Baxter book does, as I've found out since, is it makes everything seem so completely plausible. It does tell you the science behind how the things in the book can happen, even if they're completely impossible, thousands of years beyond us things. Nevertheless, he'll describe it in such realistic scientific terms that you go, oh yeah, okay, that's plausible. So then what happened? And so there was one book that he wrote. I think it was Raft. Anyway, I can't remember. There was one book that he wrote where it wasn't until I'd finished reading the book, as I was reading it, I was going, okay, yeah, and then that happens, yeah, and I actually thought it was a bit boring. And then I got to the end and I was like, hang on a minute, I just read about whales flying through space, diving into a black hole, and ending up in another galaxy. But it was, and someone hooking onto one of them and riding it through the stars. But it was so realistically described that I essentially just thought I was reading facts. And that's what he'll do. And he and sometimes, as I say, it's sort of gripping and engaging. Sometimes it's a bit too heavy, and the science is so much the focus that someone like me drifts off a bit. But if you're into that, if you want to know how sort of crazy science fiction things could plausibly happen, or at least if you want to be convinced they could plausibly happen, then Stephen Baxter's your man. And just from an idiot sensory perspective, this and its sequels, Time, Space, Origin, and are you nearly there? Phase Space. It's just one of the best looking series of sci-fi books I've seen, and it always dismays me that you can get the books in any other cover. Like those aren't the original covers, I don't think. They might be, I don't know. But you actually, I think they are. But you can more readily get them in other covers now. And I'm like, no, I want the Ring ones. I want everyone. Whenever I see it at a shop, I always just like put it at the front, so some other kid will be like, ah, cool, I'm having that.
Speaking of time travel, is there a book or movie? Because the thing with time travel, I was thinking the other day, it's always just that one person. Imagine if everyone had the power of time travel and the chaos that would ensue because of that.
Yeah.
Is there a story anywhere that fits the bill where a multitude of people have the power unaware of each other?
Not that I know of, but there is. Well, actually, let me not hijack this. Does anyone else know if there is one?
Mm-mm.
Well, what there is, and this is by Stephen Baxter and Terry Pratchett, is the Long Earth, which is it's not time travel, but it is dimensional travel. The concept is that they find out how to easily and personally and individually, with a little box with a switch on it, jump between dimensions, and it's that idea of, you know, the someone makes a decision that branches off to another dimension. So in other words, there are infinite Earths, and because there are infinite Earths, infinite of them are the same as this Earth, infinite of them are different. You know, there's all these different possible Earths, and what that means for the human race is infinite resources. We can just pop into a parallel Earth and mine there, or burn down the forests, or whatever it is we want. And this very quickly becomes a complicated situation, and then the sequel is the Long War, and so you've got people claiming their own Earths. You've got all sorts of difficulties. I haven't read the whole thing. I listened to the audiobook, but it was a bit slow for my liking. I'm told that actually reading the book in this case is the way to go, so I think I will. It's more. I think I was expecting it to be more Pratchett than Baxter. When they were announced that they were teaming up, I thought this is perfect because you've got Stephen Baxter coming in with the high science ideas, like these crazy hard sci-fi concepts, and then Terry Pratchett will put the character on top of that, and it'll be the perfect marriage. As it turned out, it read to me more Stephen Baxter than Pratchett. I'm not sure where Pratchett is in the book. I didn't feel him there. But, as I say, that was... I was listening to the audiobook, so I think I need to read the real book and do it at my own pace. But B, it was into Pratchett's illness. And so who knows, you know, what he can even do anymore. So I don't know. But that's well worth a look because it's quite similar to what you were just saying, but just with, you know, dimensional travel rather than time travel.
Yeah. How I got onto that, I'm a big fan, this is getting away from books a bit, but I'm a big fan of MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games.
Really? Ah.
And I just had this idea, because there are games with time travel in them, but they're part and parcel, they're designed, like it's part of the plot. You know, this level you'll go back to last Wednesday because of something you did in the previous level. Imagine if there was an MMO where every individual player could time travel within the constraints of that game, and they didn't have to if they didn't want to. So you could go back. So
it's recording what every player's moves were, and then if you time travel, it's still got the record of what everyone did.
Exactly. So you could go back and mess with some. So you wouldn't be able to interact with them because it'd just be a recording, but you could interact with houses that they built, or non-playable characters, and buy like a suit of armor before they bought it.
But what would happen then is that you would be playing the game, and let's say you're in, you know, basically everyone would, the fight would be on for everyone to go back further in time and be the first person on the timeline, because anyone after them would have a disadvantage. And so if you were playing in, like, this, of course, the concept confuses this, but let's say the present.
Yeah.
Every item you owned, every quest you'd finished would be in constant. It would just be fluxing. It would be the information would be changing as 1,000 players affect it in the past all at the same time in different ways. It would be carnage.
That's the whole point.
Absolute chaos.
See, what I was hoping that, it would be a nightmare to program, and yet it would be a hacker's dream to hack. What I would think, try and program it in such a way that it doesn't necessarily happen how we think it would happen, and actually let the computer figure out how it happens. And how I got onto thinking that is because researchers at the University of Queensland have recently discovered, after running as computer simulation, that the grandfather paradox resolves itself on a quantum level.
Go on. That's interesting.
Well, that's all I read of the article.
Oh, you...
But
if you still got it, because I want to read that.
Oh, yeah. Hang on, I will find the link. But the thing is that they ran like a computer atomic simulation and sent like an atom or whatever back in time to kill its own grandfather or whatever, and it still worked. So basically, if you did go back and alter the timeline, you wouldn't actually. It would resolve itself in some way, and you would continue to exist in that timeline.
Oh, I see. So the idea being not on a real life quantum level, but in a story level, the history would reknit itself so that by some other means the present persists.
Yes, in its own way.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm curious to know, to put that in an MMORPG video game. Would it go the way we think it goes? Like, how would the computer resolve it if it was left entirely to the computer?
Yeah, so if so you're in the present, you time travel to the past, you change something.
Yes.
But the present remains similar, and if you go to the middle point, that's now changed in some way to lead to the present again, something like that.
Run that by me again. Sorry, I was just finding the link. No, I'm trying to find the link for you.
Well, I was saying, okay, so you've got the present in the game, you've got the past in the game. Do it the other way around for the sake of the camera. Present, past. Yeah. And then you go to the past, you change something, you go back to the present, it's about the same because history has reknitted itself. Then you go to the midpoint, that's changed. Oh no, because history would have to reknit itself to make the midpoint be the same as well. Oh, I don't know. It's no Sonic 2D, put it that way.
We as human beings, while we can imagine the concept of time travel, we can't actually comprehend it, as you've just discovered, because the midpoint is its own present.
Mm. Well, I mean, one resolution to that is the multiple dimensions idea. Like if you change the timeline and then the future is different, well,
yeah,
then one possibility is that, well, if the future is different, then the future where you went back in time is different. So why would that have ever happened? But it could be, you could say that, hey, now you're in another dimension. Oh, what do you want, Zach? Sorry.
No, it's talking about multiple dimensions and time travel. This is actually something I had been. I'm actually laying the ground rules for this, but
Just hold that thought. I just want to say we've got about 15 minutes left because there's other people that want to use the line. So,
all right.
So while they're Skyping, I don't want the... So anyway, continue. So I've got about 15 minutes left.
Basically, working on a long epic story basically involving multiple dimensions. Long story short, there is a first universe where all of the myths, fairy tales, and gods were real.
Right, and everything since has been deviations from that dimension until you reach the point where our reality is reality. Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
And the only reason we know about these gods is because they actually discovered dimensional travel, and they actually came and basically interfered because the only reason why they came to Earth in the first place was they realized we were the least advanced civilization in all of existence and were therefore the most pliable to their wants and desires.
That's interesting. That's cool.
And basically, at some point in the timeline, all the gods decided to get together and form a council of gods. And they manage the multiverse. They basically sit upon a lofty throne and manage all of the multiverse. At the same time, you have angels that keep showing up and telling them, we like what you're doing, but tweak a little bit, because upper management is still not happy. And so it basically combines all the mythologies and stuff into one great big potluck of But they do actually, in the story, they do actually reference time travel. Except because I grew up loving time travel. I read Time Machine, watched different movies and stuff about time travel, but the idea for my story was that time travel is described as a ball of yarn, ever growing outward from a starting point. And time travel is like taking a crochet needle with a large hook and trying to pull it through the ball of yarn. And what you're doing is you're taking the outermost layer of yarn and dragging it through. And what this does is, by the time you get to the point where you are, you've pulled in so much yarn because you're tearing through layers upon layers of built-up time that by the time it gets there, it tears itself apart and it causes the universe to begin to unravel. So the gods basically said time travel is illegal. It can never be attempted. It cannot be done. There is no such thing as time travel. They stressed this point throughout their history. Because the gods basically shared all their knowledge with humanity, technology jumps thousands of years beyond what it should. 1600 AD, a human basically says this: I want to do this. I want to be the first one to perfect the time machine. And so he experiments and experiments and experiments, and as soon as he gets this close to perfecting it, the Goon Squad, working for the lead goddess, shows up, arrests him on the spot, puts his machine inside of a vault, and they execute him for high treason. Because the gods are terrified of the consequence of time travel. Long story short, by the very end of it, so many scientists have worked on this machine, it works. And more importantly, the machine fools time by making it think that that traveling through time is actually just another piece of string being pulled through the ball of yarn, so that way it doesn't actually connect to anything and will deposit you in one place, but it's a one-way trip.
Here's the thing about time travel. Now I'm starting to get into the weird territory. I'm a big fan of reading alien abduction stories. Whether I believe in it or not is one thing. I just enjoy the stories. Supposedly, some alien abductions are actually not alien at all. We actually do figure out the secret to time travel thousands of years in the future, and we come back on our own personal timeline to try and fix something that mucked up, because apparently...
When we've evolved so that our heads are bigger and our bodies are smaller. And...
Yes, and we have large, big black eyes. But there's another theory that those are actually robots, because meaning we do eventually perfect robot technology as well, along with time travel. The idea, apparently in the far future, we screw up majorly, and they figure out time travel and come back and change little things here and there that the butterfly effect, as you say, time re-knits itself.
Right, yeah.
To be a better version of what it was, so we set ourselves on a course to not make the same mistakes we did.
Well, I wish them the best of luck.
and
I'd
that's
like to.
yep.
I'd just like to, just thinking about all this and what Zach was saying, this may have been said before, I may have missed it, but out of the four of us present, who is currently or has in the past attempted to actually write a full-fledged novel?
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah.
How far did we get?
Now mine's. Hang on a sec. My first novel was 64 A4 pages long. My current novel is 203 pages long and is a work in progress, which I've currently put on the side while I get my English as a foreign language teacher certificate. So,
mine's ongoing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
How
have
many pages?
Who's talking now? It's confusing.
How many pages?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. It's mine was more of a. I wasn't writing it. I was very intricately planning the whole thing. So it was sort of half writing and half just figuring out what everything was. But I mean, it's just ongoing. So I don't know. I haven't given it up. I'm still doing it. But
Yeah,
it's
so-
not my main. It's not my main job. So it goes on in the background while I do other stuff. You know.
Is it something you hope to get published eventually?
Oh yeah, I'll be finished. Yeah, I've no plans to stop working on it. But that's, I mean, I generally don't talk about it much because I feel as if like everyone's writing a novel, aren't they? That's sort of something that you can do even if you've never written any of it. Everyone's writing a novel. You know what I mean? It's something that we all sort of in this day and age when art is currency, what with the internet. It's just sort of something we all do, and I feel as if like I ought not to go on about it until I've produced something, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah. So how about you, Maddie? How far have you gotten? Because you've told me you've got the world planned.
I've got
you're
I've
aware of
got
the hierarchy.
three on the boil.
All set in the same world?
Yeah, yes and no. It's same world, but through different time periods of the world. It's not time travel, but it's the same. I go. I don't know how deep your planning goes, Dave, but I go into government structures and you know sociological forms and all that lovely stuff and Marxism and all that brilliant things. But yeah, I've always struggled to actually start writing. It's that idea of I love to sit down and plan and put all the pieces together, but you got to actually sit down and write the damn thing one day.
So it's almost
I'm
like
gearing up for that.
you're more in love with the idea of writing a novel than the actual doing, the actual writing of the novel.
I think I would enjoy writing the novel, and I will probably end up finishing it before Christmas next year. But because of what I do, and everything that I do is project-based, and I think that's very similar to how you live as well, Dave. So you got to prioritize. No, this one needs to get finished before I can really sink my teeth into that one, and then I might have to do this one to pay the rent for the next so and so until I can focus on that again. So.
Yeah, I'm also writing another book which is off to the side. Zach's read one of the stories from it, a bunch of short stories, just all set in the same town. But I'm umming and ahhing, do I release it as a compilation of short stories that's all just happened in this one town, or do I novelize it and give it, you know, structure, introduction, main story, climax, conclusion?
Maybe in your case, then, you're in the perfect position to do something like what we were talking about before. What if you carry on as you are until one story or thread of stories or group of stories starts to stand out as the novel? Take everything else and see and experiment with releasing those as ebooks. And, you know, actually sell them, make a few pennies on that, see what you can do, see if you can get people interested, build up to the novel, something like that.
Oh, I see. So they'd already have these characters and stories in their mind already. So when the novel comes out, the novel's almost like a sequel to a compilation of short stories.
Could be, or the novel being the... I mean, well, for example, me and Abby are doing a comic at the moment, which is called Imaginary Gumbo, and it's a series of short, you know, one-off comics that don't have any particular timeline with these characters. And this is all sort of helping us to develop art style, writing style, and so on, because what we have planned is the story of these characters, which we'll do as an ongoing at some point when we're good enough, or when we've figured out the best way to release that, or whatever, or when there's simply time to do it between jobs. And in the meantime, we're finding out what works about the characters, what people like about them, what they don't, and just seeing how it goes. And so that's sort of the comics equivalent, I suppose, of something that you are in a position more or less to do, which is to figure out, well, this is the story of these characters, and then here's side stories, other stuff that you can use either as an introduction or as anything. You know, you're in charge of it. You can use it however it wants.
My challenge to myself was to write something as dull as possible, when nothing, like Seinfeld, nothing happens. Kind of, it's a bunch of short stories about nothing, and that's more challenging than you think. You have to be really creative.
No, I'm sure it is. Yeah.
And then he sent it to me, sent one of them to me, and he's just like, "What do you think?" And I'm just like, "I love slice of life."
Yeah, it's a teen. I guess probably aimed at teenagers-ish. Slice of life fiction, slice of life realist teenage young adult fiction would be the genre.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 6 minutes left. If anyone wants to wrap up with their final few thoughts.
I'm terrified of saying anything because we'll be here for another 3 hours and you'll get yelled at. So I'm good.
Well, you know what? Let me drop this in here. I think we should do books again soon, because frankly, Matty wasn't here, and he probably has the most to say about it.
Mm-hmm.
We're obviously able to go on.
No, I will say this really quickly. In my own stuff, the thing I finished was technically a novella, except I use the Osamu Tezuka star system of characters, which is that all the characters are basically like paid actors. They appear, and in fact, I do this very subtly, in that each story has cameos from characters that appear in other things, but in different roles. Like the two main characters of the God story, they appear as a couple in a ballet troupe. Similar appearances, similar names, but they're cameoed. And so it gets the idea across that maybe this universe is just a deviation from the original universe. And that each universe is each work sort of interconnected in a way, but it's just something I do just to make myself giggle when I'm when I'm editing it, and I'm just like, he, I know what this character is going to do in this story.
Part of I don't plan so much. I just write as I go. It's like watching a TV show. I'm as excited to find out what's going to happen as I'm writing it. It's like, my God, what's going to happen next? But what I've done, because Matty's saying he's got the governments and the characters, and he knows the subculture of the world and all the intricacies of how it works. In my novel that I'm writing, I'm like, okay, it's basically Earth, but it's not Earth. It's some other planet. So as far as political goes, it's Earth. Basically, it works the same as Earth works, except it's not Earth. It's some other planet out there somewhere.
And one other thing I did want to say earlier on, but my internet crapped out. I know everyone talked about their parents reading to them. I have a kid sister who's 3 years younger than me, and when I was a kid, I used to read to her. It was this Dr. Seuss book. And I was the only one that was allowed to read it to her. Because when I read it to her, I would read it in the silliest voices I could do. And she was so thrilled that I would read this, like, basically Dr. Seuss counting book, and I'd read it like this! And I'd do these really, really cartoonish well, of course, my voice was, like, high-pitched and squeaky at the time. And so I'd read it in these childish, really high-pitched, squeaky voices, and she would fall off. She would laugh so hard she'd fall off her bed. And like parents would be like, "Is everything okay?" And my sister just on the floor laughing uncontrollably, and I'm just like, "Oh, I'm just reading to her," and it was the most confusing thing because I'm sitting there reading a Dr. Seuss book, and she's laughing. But no, that was just one of my favorite moments with books, was just because my sister and I, we had completely different interests, and it was the one thing we could bond over was me reading this book to her, and then when I got older, I gave her some of my my books to read. I encouraged her to listen to the original William Hurt reading of Polar Express, which is why I can't enjoy the movie, because anytime Tom Hanks speaks to Santa Claus, I almost jump up and scream, "You're not William Hurt!"
Zach, you don't need any reason specifically to not enjoy that movie. It's a very difficult movie to enjoy.
Yeah. Plus, also, I actually did. If you actually go to YouTube and look up William Hurt Polar Express, someone uploaded the full reading of it. And so it's actually really interesting because he reads it in this monotone voice that almost it kind of lulls you, like when you're a kid listening to it, it lulls you into this dream. And the only other audiobook I have is the World War Z audiobook, which is, if anyone's ever read World War Z, it's basically just a collection of interviews. But what they did for it was they got the author of the book, Max Brooks, to be the interviewer. And then they got a cast of actors and actresses to be the interviewees. And basically, it's not fully unabridged, but one of the best ones is about this guy who was a Australian astronaut, and how he spent the duration of the zombie war in the International Space Station, keeping the GPS satellites alive. And it's easily the saddest story in the entire book, because he just talks about how, at the very end of his little vignette, he goes, "Did I care about the radiation exposure? No. The pain? No. The meds? No. We did it for the good of the people." And it's just this one. If anyone's never read World War Z, I recommend it. It takes place after the fact, and it's basically just a collection of survivor stories. But yeah, I just want to get that across. Yeah.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it for this week.
Sorry.
So I think I've actually been thinking of the idea each week we'd follow up the previous week's topic. So maybe we could do that from now on. So what was last week's topic? Whatever last week's topic was, we'd start each episode.
Games, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, doing games, and then move into the current topic. So next week. Anyway, I have to go for reasons, because other people need to use the Googles. So I will see you all next week, if not before.
Fantastic. Look forward to it.
Bye.